All right, we want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon for the Port A Lecture Series. Um, we have a great speaker today. We have a program extension specialist in entomology, Miss Molly Keck is with us, and she's going to be talking about insect pests and IPM strategies. Also, we want to remind you in December that we'll be talking about beneficial insects. So thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Molly Keck.
All right, thank you. Okay, let me get this up and shared. And should be popped up there now for you guys. So thanks for inviting me. I appreciate the invitation, and especially like that we could do this virtually, even though I'm in San Antonio, didn't have to make the trip, even though it's always a nice trip to come down to the Corpus area. But I was going to kind of give you a hodgepodge of some of the common landscape and ornamental pests that you might come across in just any general landscape. So one thing to remember before we really start talking about the insects that are in there is that for most of your very well established landscape plants, they don't often have major insect issues with them unless they're stressed out for some reason. So super established plants are generally pretty not benign to getting insects, but it doesn't happen very often. So if you think about like trees outside or shrubs or bushes that have been there for a good long time, you don't often see significant insect damage. You can see insects on them, but usually it's not like major damage. It's the young transplants that you are first putting in the springtime or even in the fall time or all year round. But those young baby transplants are generally the ones that are the most vulnerable because they are really tender and juicy and easy for them to feed on. So if you're finding that on some of those what should be established plants, you're having an insect issue, then there are some cultural things that you want to try to consider. Like, is there too little or too much water? Are they getting not quite the amount of sun that kind of plant wants to get? I always ask, how old is that plant? Because not every plant lives forever. There is a finite lifespan to many plants. And so if it's coming to the end of its life, then it is going to attract more insects to it. And oftentimes it's better just to put it out of its misery and replace it with something else. And then always, if you have the wrong variety, you planted it during the wrong season, it's not in the right spot because the soil doesn't drain well and they really want that, then they are always going to be stressed out and encouraging insects on them. So usually if something has a major insect issue, it's our fault. We've done something or somebody did something to cause that problem. It's not necessarily Mother Nature that did. So I also think that when you're looking at some of those, any insect actually that's causing damage to any type of plant, it's good to know the difference between an insect that chews versus an insect that has piercing, sucking mouth parts, because the damage they do is different. The way they feed on the plant and hang out on the plant is very different. Chewing insects can feed at night, but they eat a lot of that plant. They spend a lot of time on the plant. They're really kind of sloppy eaters, and so it's very easy to kill them off with residual pesticides. Whereas sucking insects are usually smaller. They congregate on the plant, and their damage is more of that kind of wilted or deformed look that you see on that right-hand picture. And I'll show you other pictures also. But let me see if I can get this to play, and I bet you it's not going to. It's not. So if you can imagine that grasshopper chewing, it's supposed to be a video of a grasshopper chewing, but they have chewing mouth parts like we do, except instead of their teeth being horizontal like ours are, they're turned 90 degrees so that they're vertical. So I always say we eat like a hamburger, they eat like a hot dog. So they chomp on the edges of that leaf or that plant. And the bigger the bug, the bigger the head it has, and the larger the mouth parts it's going to have. So it's going to feed and make larger holes in the plant. If you see giant holes in a plant, you're looking for someone big. If you see tiny little, BB-sized holes, you're looking for somebody probably about that size. And these guys are super lazy at feeding. They rub all over the plant. They eat, a large portion of that tissue. They also can lick their feet, their toes when they get stuff on it. So you're able to put that pesticide inside of their body by using residual products without necessarily seeing them. And also, even if they don't eat enough of it, they rub their body all over it, or they lick their fingers and they ingest more of that pesticide. And there are a lot of insects that have chewing mouth parts. Wasps have them, some bees have them, walking sticks, praying mantises. But the ones that generally hurt plants are pretty much narrowed down to grasshoppers, beetles, and caterpillars. And then non-insects, but relatives of insects would be pillbugs or millipedes. So for me, you've narrowed it down from millions of options to just a handful. And I think that's a little easier to try to handle and figure out. And I bet you this one's not going to play either, but this was a video of a green stink bug showing its mouth parts. So if you can just pretend like you're an insect and your teeth are no longer teeth anymore, they've been modified into a big gigantic straw. That's the way insects that do piercing and sucking are modified. So instead of having teeth, they just have this one tiny little straw. And instead of having kind of lips that protect their teeth, they have a sheath that protects that straw. So they just pierce with the the very tip of their mouth parts and the tippy tips of their toes. So they're kind of more dainty. They don't spend a lot of time on the plant. They generally feed and go if they have wings to be able to feed and go. But luckily, a lot of them are pretty sessile. They're not moving. They are in huge numbers, so it's easy to kill lots of them. And you generally see them on the plant. They're not like a chewing insect that can feed at night and not be seen during the day when you're looking at the plants. And so these are all of the stink bugs. Aphids, whiteflies, mealybugs, scales, stink bugs are also true bugs. All the hoppers, like flea hoppers, frog hoppers, leaf hoppers, kind of the sharpshooter type insects, they all have piercing. So they pierce the plant tissue and they suck out the juices. Different from, say, a butterfly, which has siphoning mouth parts. They don't pierce anything. They just lap up or suck up the nectar. And since they're not taking chunks of fleshy tissue out of the plant, the damage you see is kind of a deformed or wilted look. It might be almost a gall-like type appearance on the leaves. You also oftentimes have discoloration of the leaves. And like that bottom left-hand picture, you have dead portions of the leaf that might kind of crumble out, but it's not like they took a fresh piece of tissue out of the plant. So I think it's important to know what kind of damage a chewing insect does versus somebody that does sucking damage, because a lot of times for insects that pierce and suck, systemics are a very valid and viable option depending on if you're worried about pollinators or not and the timing of when you apply those pesticides. I will always say that if your plant has enough insect damage, enough insects on it to warrant and justify treating for it, then it's too weak to be blooming anyway. So you're not hurting pollinators if you're treating those blooming ornamental type plants. But knowing if it's sucking damage or chewing damage kind of also tells you where you should look on that plant to see if you can find those bad bugs. And also tells you that residuals do nothing for insects that do piercing and sucking unless you physically see them on the plant, because they're not grooming themselves, they're not rubbing all over the plant, all those types of things. So again, if it's an ornamental plant, they're at their most vulnerable when they're very young transplants or they're stressed out for some reason. And so, you can call ornamentals a number of things. Trees and shrubs can be ornamentals, flowering plants, even some grasses can be considered ornamental. So I'm not going to really talk about insects on specific types of plants, but more so these are insects that can be on any of these types of plants, just kind of the general guys that are super common no matter where you are in the nation or the world or anything like that. So I mentioned grasshoppers, caterpillars, and beetles being our major culprits for making holes in plants. Grasshoppers are usually an issue in spring to summer. I'm still seeing some grasshoppers in the San Antonio area, so I'm sure you guys are seeing them down where it's warmer for longer. But you usually have major issues with grasshoppers in areas where you have pastures or fields close to that cultivated area, because the adults will lay their eggs in the soil and then all those eggs hatch out. And they're kind of unique. Usually if we have a really wet period of time, that allows insects to proliferate. But with grasshoppers, it causes fungal growth in the soil that kills the eggs. So drier years, you generally see an outbreak of grasshoppers. Pretty much, if you cannot control the pasture that they're laying their eggs in, where you can till it, expose those eggs to the sunlight and let them dry out, or you can treat in those pasture-like areas or fields, then all you're really doing is applying something to the plants that you're trying to keep them off of. So, carbaryl or the seven products, or synthetic pyrethroids like cyfluthrin or permethrin. Acephate, which is usually ortho products, is another option. But you're forming a barrier. They feed on the plant, they get sick and they die. They don't share it with their buddies. You're just killing who you kill. But you're not really putting a huge dent in the population. A lot of people ask about the no-low baits, and these are really only effective against the younger grasshoppers. And it's not really good for someone in a home garden situation because they can't apply it. They catch it too late and they don't ever know where to apply that bait. But if you know that you've got a garden area that you worry about grasshoppers consuming, and it's surrounded by a field that you can apply that no-low bait to in the early spring, then you probably can see a reduced population of grasshoppers. But in my opinion, while it is organic and more environmentally friendly, you spend a lot of money, and it's kind of a crapshoot if it's really going to work or not. The millipedes and sow bugs are not insects, or they're also called isopods. Pill bugs, sow bugs are a type of isopod. These are not insects, but they're relatives of insects. And I just really mentioned them, especially for you guys in your area, because you have higher humidity and more moisture than other areas of the state. And so these guys are probably a major issue for you. They really only like to feed on decaying organic matter, fungal material in the soil. But when you have overcrowded situations in a garden or a bed, and I always see this in herbs, where you have kind of an herb bed and they have dropped seeds, and so you kind of over time get this heavy buildup of herbs, and you start to move away those plants and they will just be loaded up with these isopods. They feed on that really tender growth, but they do not go after the more established, stronger leaves. So usually it's the first leaves that have kind of fallen onto the soil and they've got organic matter growing on it. Really the best thing to do is reduce the moisture in some way if you can, turn the mulch over, cut back on watering a little bit. If they're brand new transplants, some people will do, it's very tedious, but you can take a PVC pipe or a soda can and cut the top and the bottom out and make a sleeve and protect that plant until you think that it's strong enough. But I've also seen it where somehow they manage to get in and fall into that can, and they get stuck there, and so they eat it down to nothing. But usually you've got to have hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds for these to really be a major issue inside of a garden, a bed, or any landscape. Now, beetles are kind of an annoying insect to deal with on ornamental plants. These are leaf feeders, and I just found on the internet a bunch of pictures of leaf feeding beetles. So they vary in size and color. Usually kind of the ones on the bottom that are really metallic thrive in the hot times of the summertime, it seems like. Sometimes they become such an issue on those young transplants that it is smarter just to pull them up and start all over again. This is more so for like a vegetable garden where that plant will never be able to grow and catch up to the point that it should be at, so it never really produces the fruit you want it to. But same thing for your ornamentals as well. If they're young transplants and they're just getting chewed up by these guys, pull them up, start again with a larger, more established plant that you can get from the nursery. You can try to cover the plants. The damage they do usually is very small holes that you see there. So it's aesthetic. It's usually not going to hurt the plant overall if it's a little bit older. Use different pesticides as well to try to kill the ones that come in there. Carbaryl, neem is an organic option, but you have to reapply it very often. Permethrin or other synthetic pyrethroids are also helpful, but they're tough because they're mobile. So they eat and leave. And then that mobility also allows them to spread really easily in the landscape, or go elsewhere, find a place to overwinter, and then start fresh in the springtime when you're putting out some new color. Green June bugs, I don't know if you guys have a problem with them down where you are, but every now and then green June bugs will have these outbreaks that become a problem for fruiting trees. And in the late summertime, I guess it is, early fall, we will have swarms of these guys. And when they're swarming, they're just mating. They're not a major concern. But except for that kind of late summer, early fall time, it's usually in the springtime, they'll come out and they'll start feeding on that new growth that your fruiting trees have pushed out, if it's not an evergreen fruiting tree. And they will eat all that up, and then it has nothing left to photosynthesize, and so you're not going to get the fruit yield that you want from it. So that is a larger type of damaging insect, but mainly specific to orchards and fruit trees. And something that you can put on the leaves, synthetic pyrethroid, something like that, to try to kill those that are feeding is really the best solution for them. Now, caterpillars are the last chewer that I'm going to talk about. And it really doesn't matter what kind of caterpillar it is. I know that, the public especially always wants to know exactly what something is. But what I would just caution you on is so first of all, if it's a boring caterpillar, like it's green or brown and it's not very pretty, it is going to turn into a boring moth. It's not the ugly duckling and it turns into the swan. If it's a cool looking caterpillar, like the monarch you see on the top picture and the Gulf fritillary on the bottom, they'll turn into usually a butterfly that's pretty attractive. So if it's a cool looking caterpillar and you have tons of them and you knock them out, you probably knocked out some really neat looking caterpillars or butterflies. But the other thing is that you can very easily just use Dr. Google. And when people send me a picture of a caterpillar, I always ask, what was it on? And I will Google caterpillar, host plant, whatever the plant was. And they're pretty host specific. So generally I'll get an idea of what it will become and what it's called. And then I can make that decision if it's really harmful to that plant or if the benefit is keeping the butterfly around. And the other thing to remember is that sometimes we plant things like milkweed or passion flower or pipevine, and there are specific caterpillars or butterflies that will come lay their eggs and their offspring will chew it down and feed on it. So be knowledgeable about what you're planting as well, because you could be the reason that those things are drawn in because you're planting their host plant. So some of the common caterpillars, and if y'all don't have mountain laurels down where you guys are, then interrupt me and I'll just kind of skim over this. But if you have mountain laurels, then a very common caterpillar that you will have is the Genista caterpillar. And it's unique because it's able to overcome the toxicity that mountain laurels have. So they're one of the few things that can really feed on them. If it is a baby little plant that you want to get bigger, then I would do something about the Genista caterpillars. If it is a huge mountain laurel or a pretty significantly sized mountain laurel, I wouldn't worry about it. All it's going to do is maybe keep it from growing too much more that year. But the plants that you want to get bigger, you want to do something about these caterpillars. Caterpillars, any caterpillar, you can control organically with BT. BTV is for caterpillars. So get the worm, it should say like worms or something on the BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, specific just for caterpillars, kills nothing else except for caterpillars. And then spinosad is another good organic option, or just permethrin or any other synthetic pyrethroid. And generally, when you see a good number of caterpillars early on in a season, you're going to see more of them later on. So you kind of want to jump on these early, not just for these Genista caterpillars, but others as well. Tent caterpillars you guys might see in trees. There's tent caterpillars. There are webworms, and then there's another one that we get around our area called an oak leaf roller that all make kind of a webbing around trees. Tent caterpillars don't turn into anything really pretty, so if you feel bad about killing them, you're not killing anything that will be that attractive. They like to build their tents or this webbing in like the crotches or where the branches kind of branch off the V of the tree. And they feed outside of that, but they will hang out in the webbing. So they leave to feed, which makes them a little easier to kill and it also makes the population smaller because natural enemies can find them. But that way you can apply pesticide to the food, and when they go out to feed, they get sick and they die from it. Different from webworms that make the webbing, feed inside of the webbing, and then move on. So they're not as susceptible to natural enemies unless you can break that webbing open. And they also they protect themselves inside of there, so populations can rise. It's hard to get pesticides to it. So if you can do anything, break the webs open in whatever way you can, and then apply whatever you like for caterpillars to the tree. There's no law in the state of Texas that says if the neighbor has webworms that they have to do something about it to save your trees. I get that question quite a bit, but the tree will be fine. It will leaf back out again when it's time to leaf back out again. Sometimes bagworms can be a major issue if you have especially a lot of kind of evergreen type trees, cypress type trees. I don't know if y'all have a lot down where you guys are, but I just kind of throw these guys in here and mention it because they're kind of a neat looking thing. There's a caterpillar inside there. It makes this bag and it will kind of move around the eaves of your house or a branch and pop its head out and feed and go back inside. And usually you have one or two. I mean, on a good year, you might have 10 of them around your house. But some years they can be pretty damaging. Like you can see them dangling from that tree, and then you can also see how it's dying as they're moving up. So sometimes they can be a pretty bad issue, and they can be tough to kill because they're protected. So you're really trying to treat the live part of the tree to kill them as they feed on that new stuff, or knock those bagworms down if they're easy to reach and smash them and tedious, but you can kill a lot that way without using pesticides. Any of the hornworm type caterpillars that turn into some sort of a sphinx moth, these guys you might recognize as being a damaging pest on your tomato plants, but that's a specific species of hornworm, the tomato hornworm. There are lots of hornworms that will go after bougainvilleas and esperanzas and other pretty, flowering ornamental plants. I've even seen one time on Pride of Barbados. So they feed on all sorts of stuff. And then will turn into some sort of a sphinx moth, but they are ravenous in what they feed. They're fat, thicker than your thumb, really long, and I mean, almost like nauseating how gigantic they can be. So BT, spinosad, or hand pick them off if you can. Generally, you don't see a lot of them on the plant. You might see one or two, and they're easy to hand pick off. And if the plant is large, it usually has enough leaf number to it so that you don't see what they've been necessarily feeding on. But a small plant, you're going to see some damage to it. I'm going to skip over armyworms because we're not doing turf and move into just the sucking insects. So there's that tooth, instead of being able to chew, this guy has a long tooth that he is injecting into the plant tissue and then sucking the juices out of it. And so that's what causes that wilting or deformed look. And they generally like new growth because that's softer. There's more juices flowing through them. So whenever there's new growth, you usually see the most sucking insect damage. And aphids are an insect that pierces insects and is terrible on plants. Any kind of plant you can name aphids, there's a species of aphid that will utilize it as a host. So aphids like locations that are overcrowded. When you have major aphid issues, it generally means that there's overcrowding, there's poor air circulation. So you've tried to plant too many things together, it's gotten too thick, you need to start thinning things out. It can also happen when we're overwatering and we have intense humidity under those thick, heavy leaves, causing more poor air circulation, or when the plant's at the end of its season. And I see this usually in the summertime when it's just hot as it can be, and those plants just want to die off, and the aphids come in and they explode because the plant cannot fight them off any longer. The thing about aphids is they are pretty easy to manage. They're pretty wimpy. But you have to almost get on a regimen, because when you treat that plant right there for aphids, that leaf doesn't look like it has tons of it on there, but there's a good number, those little yellow bugs. Well, when you spray for aphids, no matter what it is that you use, you kill a portion of the population. You're probably not going to kill all of them. And they can tell that they need to replace what you've killed off. And so they will ramp up reproduction mode and double their efforts. And if you don't come back out 10 to 14 days later to retreat, you often will find that the aphids are worse after 2 to 3 weeks. So you want to take advantage of doing multiple treatments, at least 2, so that you knock out a good chunk of the population and then come back and knock the rest of them out. Aphids don't need males to mate. They just pop out identical clones of themselves, and they do that very fast when they feel stressed and that there's not enough of their buddies close by. So anything kills them. Insecticidal soaps, horticultural oils if you want to be organic, anything labeled for the plant, even heavy water sprays are effective. And one thing I will say is that if you have a plant that otherwise looks fine, it's green and it's pretty, but it's not blooming, then you might just check for aphids or other sucking insects, because it may be that the load of those bad bugs is just high enough that it's putting enough stress on the plant, not to hurt it or make it look bad, but so that the plant is focusing all of its energy into repairing the damage they're doing to the leaves, and there's no energy left to make a bloom. And so you're not getting the flowering from it. But otherwise, the plant seems to look fine. Whiteflies are an issue where you have more humidity. When things are a little bit wetter, we're having kind of a wetter season. They are not necessarily very common when it's the hot times of the summer, or right now when it's starting to cool off. But they are really common in the springtime. That's when their populations get very high. And then just depending on the plant, I guess, in location, they could persist all year round if the temperatures are right. And they're similar to aphids. Be persistent. Whatever you utilize, read the label. Come back when it says you can retreat on that plant, because they will do kind of the same thing where they will reproduce very quickly. And if it's like a greenhouse situation or somewhere where monitoring is really important for these whiteflies, or just management of them is important, they're attracted to yellow things. So if you put out yellow sticky traps, it'll give you a good idea of if they're in the area or not. And they're pretty easy to kill also. The insecticidal soaps and horticultural oils, neem, and acephate is kind of a much quicker, fast knockdown with a little bit longer residual. Lace bugs are a summertime pest, so we're probably outside of the time or the realm when these guys are a problem. But if you have lantana, azaleas, think of those kind of ornamental type flowering plants similar to that, things that thrive and do very well when it's hot outside. When we're in July and August, you will notice lace bug issues, and you get that stippled effect on the leaves. And when you turn the leaves over, you see their poop, you see their frass, you see their babies, and you see them, and they kind of have this cool kind of lacy look to them. They're not very large, but they are bigger than aphids, but you still kind of have to squint and take a good look. It's easy to overlook them. That damage is real similar to thrips damage, to spider mites damage, but you don't see spider mites under the leaves. So if you can reduce the temperature in some way, you can water a little bit more, move that potted plant that they happen to be on in the shade, use some artificial type shading around those plants. Oftentimes that will make the population at a level that is not as damaging to the plant, so the damage isn't as noticeable. If you treat for them, you have to get under the leaves, and it's kind of the same, rinse and repeat, same type products. Insecticidal soaps work well, horticultural oils, neem oil. Be real careful with using those when it's very hot outside, and you don't want to use them. You kind of want to use them like in the evening or early in the morning before it's gotten very sunny, so that the sun doesn't burn up the plants. And blasts of water too, for any of these sucking insects where you have lots of them on the bottom of the plant. If you can blast the heck out of it with some just plain water, then you can break enough off to maybe lower that population to not see damage. So speaking of spider mites, they also produce that stippling effect, and these are also a heat-loving type of an insect, but we'll see them in greenhouses year-round when you don't have really good airflow. They are a mite, but they will make webbing, and that's how they get the name spider mite. And there's multiple species of them. We also have a lot of predatory mite species that actually really help keep spider mites in check. So a lot of times pesticides that we use will kill off our predatory mites and leave the spider mites behind in enough of a population to rebound and do very well, and you make the problem worse. So for spider mite management, you really want to make sure that you're using something that is labeled as or that is a miticide or an acaricide. Acari is the order that mites and ticks are in. So these are pesticides specific to mites and their relatives. It's not necessarily going to say on the label, this is a miticide, but you want to read the list of impacted insects or animals on the label, things that it will kill, and make sure that you're using the right product and that spider mites are on there. So you notice that a lot of these active ingredients are really similar to other active ingredients that I've listed, but sometimes it's in the formulation that makes it better against spider mites. So if you're using a product and that you cannot get a control of the spider mites, then talk to your supplier and ask them, do y'all have a miticide, something specific for spider mites? And since they are heat loving, if you can reduce the temperature in some way by increasing watering or putting out some sort of a shade, then you can lower the population so that the plant can tolerate it. It doesn't look as bad. It still does what it wants to do. You don't kill off the mites, but you make it so that the plant's happier and able to live with them. Thrips are a pest that we usually see early on in the springtime. You'll notice them on hibiscus when they start to bloom, on roses especially. Roses really all year long. They are mainly, some species are pollen feeders, some species are predatory, and some species will feed on plants. A lot of times the ones that are pollen feeders inside of the flower will accidentally eat the edges of the bloom of the petals, and it doesn't look very pretty. So it doesn't look good as a cut flower. From a distance, it looks fine, but if you were to cut them and put them in a jar, they don't look great. It also stunts the growth of, especially with roses, the roses won't look as pretty and as full. So these guys love weeds, and if you can manage the weeds around the area, then you can manage thrip populations as well. Buds that are heavily infested, prune those off, deadhead them, pull them off. You're going to trap a ton of those guys in that bud. Throw it away. Don't just throw it back on the ground. Like, put it in a bag and then take it out to a trash can or something. Some people like to use reflective mulch or foil around the base of a plant because they don't like it as much. But if it's a really tall hibiscus bush or rose bush, then they don't care because that's way down low and they're 6 feet up off the ground. And then wetting the leaves often to get them wet. They're really, like, if you go outside to anything that's flowering, tap it onto a white piece of paper or your hand, and you're going to see what you think are splinters crawling around. That's how tiny thrips are. So if you're spraying them when you're watering, if you give them a good squirt and a water down, then you're going to bust off a leg or pop the head off of one or make the wings get too wet that they can't use them. So they can be managed that way, but it's much more labor intensive. And then acephate, cyfluthrin are yours. Cyfluthrin is a synthetic pyrethroid. These are non-organic options. Spinosad has some promise with thrips, but you have to use it often and you never really get them down to like zero population. But if you like going organic, then that's really the only option out there for you for thrips. There's another type of thrips that we get. So this is what's annoying about thrips. It's singular and it's plural. So, it's one thrips and it's 25 thrips. But one type of thrips that we get, that we have throughout Texas, are chili thrips. And they are something that's very difficult to control. Imidacloprid as a soil drench and a foliar drench is really all that's available for managing them. But their host range is huge, and that's why they are such an issue. So you could be right next to a farm or have a huge garden and they're messing up your roses or your other ornamentals. Or you could be right next to a cotton field and they're coming into your backyard bell peppers. So if you're using something against thrips and it's not doing anything, you might have that species of thrips and you really want to use an imidacloprid product. If it's food, you're limited on what you can use for drenches. You pretty much don't have any options. And you'll have to use it as a spray. So read the label, make sure that where you're using it is the proper place to use it. This year, it seemed like I have never gotten as many calls about scales, and I've never seen them in my own landscape as often than other years. And I don't know if it's because people were stuck at home and they were checking on their plants a lot more often, but it seemed like scales were crazy this year. So there's two types of scales. There's soft scales, which is really that right-hand picture more so. And then there are armored or hard scales, which are harder to the touch and a lot harder to kill. Soft scales reproduce faster. They make a lot of eggs. They are able to move and continue to move. And they might cause some sooty mold and leaf dieback. Whereas armored scales only make about 100 eggs, but when you've got 100 females producing 100 eggs, pretty soon the population gets pretty big. And they don't move. Once they've fed, they do not move. So they dock down, put their mouth parts in, and they don't move after that. And they will cause dieback and death of plants. So they're much more damaging, even though they move slower, produce less than soft scales are. So they will produce, so they lay this pod, this little egg pod, and you can kind of see that's kind of broken open. It looks like a piece of bread or something. And there's little orange things coming out of it. Well, those are their nymphs or their crawlers. Excuse me. And that's the baby form coming out of the egg. And every time those eggs hatch, they crawl to a new spot further up along the limb or something, and they dock down and start to feed. Well, when they're exposed and they haven't produced that hard scale, that hard wax over their body, that's the time to do something about it. So you could take like some double-sided stick tape or just monitor very often. And when you notice, when you put that double-sided stick tape, just a little bit beyond where you see the infestation, when you notice that you've got little crawlers stuck to it, now it's time to treat that plant. And guess what? They hatch about every 2 weeks. So 2 weeks later, do the same thing. And now you have a regimen and you know a good timeline of when to apply pesticides for these guys. Cottony cushion scale is another one. This is a pretty humongous host range. I'll give you some options for pesticides for all the scales in just a second. These guys also remain mobile, and they are so annoying because, kind of like mealybugs, they will hide under the lip of potted plants. And if you're using plant clips or anything like that, they will utilize that. So you have to treat everything or clean it really well with rubbing alcohol to try to kill any little tiny eggs. But they kind of look like frosting or something to me. They're real weird looking. Mealybugs are also mobile their entire life, and while they are kind of cottony or may look waxy, they're much more soft-bodied. So scales are more difficult with foliar sprays to kill. Mealybugs and the cottony cushion scale are a little easier in that way. And so you can, we know that with mealybugs, they thrive when we use a lot of nitrogen in our fertilizers. So if you can not fertilize when the mealybug populations are high, then that will help. Blasts of water, nothing will totally eliminate these a lot of times because they can hide in so many spots because they are so mobile. I'm just trying to make sure. So I want to go back to the scales because I don't have a list actually of products to use. A lot of times with those armored scales, the only option that you have to really control them is to use some sort of a systemic. And there are, drenches where you mix it and you pour it into the ground. They now make a product that's called, I can't remember what it's called, but it's imidacloprid and it comes in a little tablet. And so you can just insert it in the ground, wear some gloves and just push it in the ground. And then every time it rains or you irrigate, the plant takes it up. So that cuts back on, did I mix it correctly? Am I going to burn my plant? That kind of thing. And you measure like the diameter of the base and you pick however many little tablets to put in there. You can physically try to break them off if you have the time for it. But really armored scales, it's systemics more than foliar sprays. On soft scales, and also for both of them, they're usually not on the leaves. They're on the branches, on the stems. And so you have to target that. Soft scales, you can use neem or permethrin or acephate or other products labeled for your ornamental plant and get some pretty good results from it. You can never just treat one time and see 100% reduction. It is going to take a couple treatments at least, if not up to 3 to 4. It depends on how bad the infestation is. But because they're so good at camouflaging, you generally don't know you have an issue until it's a major issue. So woolly aphids are kind of a weird one. They're kind of related to, they're an aphid. So I really should have put them further up in the presentation, but, they're hairy little aphids. And if you look closely, they kind of move around kind of slow. You can see eyes and you can see antenna and legs. So that differentiates them from mealybugs or scales, but they can be pretty easy to manage. They generally like it after you have hail or high wind or something that cracks and makes wounds in the tree. They'll come and be attracted to that wound and start to feed on it, and then the population grows and grows. But they can be fairly easy to manage with oils and insecticidal soaps. imidacloprid is that systemic. The roots of the plant take it up, and as they feed, they feed on the pesticide. Dinotefuran is a I think that's a neonicotinoid as well. It can be a systemic or a foliar spray, and then pyrethrin is your synthetic pyrethroid. I know y'all already had lawn pests, so I'm going to keep going a little bit because I know y'all, that's the end of it. I guess if y'all want to know about this, yell out and I'll keep going. If not, I'll just take questions because I know we still have about 20 minutes, but I didn't want to speak on something that you've already gotten information on. Anybody?
You're good either way, so.
Well, that's not helpful. Do y'all have lots of questions?
We're fine. There are not any questions on my side. Ray, do you have any questions on your side?
I don't have any questions either, and yeah, we did do some stuff on lawn pests already. So, do you guys have any questions? Oh, come on.
Then I'll just get to that slide in case you guys ever have bugs that you want identified. You're more than welcome to send me emails. I know you have an entomologist in your area now finally, but if you need extra help or she's on vacation, then you can always use me as a resource.
Oh, so we have in Oasis County, there's an entomologist now?
No, at the center, right, Kevin? Her name is Holly. Is it Davies?
I have not met her yet, so I don't know. I did not know they had filled that position.
She might have already left. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that there's somebody down south, closer to you guys.
I'll have to check it out because I thought we were absent. I didn't think we had an entomologist at the district office at this point.
Are y'all? Are y'all in the same district as Atascosa County?
No, I don't think so. We're D11, so.
And I think they might be 13. So there's someone kind of close to you guys, but maybe not necessarily in your district. So
well,
I misspoke.
It's always a pleasure to just pester you. So
that's fine.
All right. So
over here, we have 9 people over here that work for the city of Port Aransas, all the groundskeepers. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem, you guys. Thanks for inviting me. Hope you'll have a good weekend. I hope the weather's as nice where you guys are as it is where I am.
It's like 83, 84 degrees here today. It's always about 5 degrees cooler in Port A. Are you guys right at 80 today?
Yeah, it's a nice day.
Yeah. Not too windy, not too crazy. Anyway, we want to thank Molly Keck for joining us today. It's always a pleasure listening to her. She does a great job with the presentations. I'm sure we'll have her back again if she's willing to come and present for us. And we want to remind you that on December the 11th, we'll be talking about beneficial insects. So be sure to join us. That is the last presentation in the series for this year. And then we'll regroup and probably get some ideas from you guys what you're interested in hearing about for 2021. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Ray. And thank you, Molly. You all have a great weekend.
Thank you, guys. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.